morning. Good morning. Katherine Marshall is a senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs and visiting professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Ms. Marshall's background is as a leader and practitioner of international development, with close to 4 decades of experience on a wide range of development issues in Africa, Latin America, East Asia, and the Middle East. Her long career with the World Bank, 1971 to 2006, involved a wide range of leadership assignments, including country director of the Sahel region and the Southern Africa. Her current teaching and research focus on the intersection of development and religion. She's executive director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue and sits on several nonprofit boards. Ms. Marshall holds degrees from Wellesley College and Princeton University. Please help me in welcoming Ms. Katherine Marshall, class of 67.
Thank you very much for that nice and fairly short introduction. That was my request, keep it short. And welcome. It's really a pleasure and joy and an honor to be here, and I hope I'll have some chance to talk to you and to get to know you. And also, I'm trying to figure out how I can get back so I can hear some of the presentations and see what comes out of this. So this is, in a sense, both a specific presentation, but it's also hoping to try to plant some ideas, and we'll have an exchange. So if you wouldn't mind cutting me off as soon as, we have until 11:30, is that right? So just make sure that I don't talk too long, and so that we do have a chance for some discussion. I think that's a critical part of the program, is that you all participate actively. So first of all, just to give you a little bit more flavor, there's a wonderful book called Composing a Life by Mary Catherine Bateson, who is Margaret Mead's daughter. And it is the story of 5 remarkable women. But her theme, Composing a Life, is that you don't live life sequentially. It's not an orderly path, that different parts of your life come together. And as you look at it, you see a composition. And her message is also in the introduction that this is something that women have always done, but that it is the modern world. That very few of you will join an institution, in a sense the way I did, working for the World Bank and worked there for years and years. Most of you will do a lot of different things, and certainly you will have very different phases of your life. So as I looked at the journey of my life and some of the issues which I wanted to bring to you, I realized that, among other things, I'm a very idealistic pragmatist, or perhaps a pragmatic idealist, but with a very strong interdisciplinary sense that goes back to my days at Wellesley when I was a history major. And one of the things that comes out of that is the theme of narrative and stories, which is what is, in a sense, the focus of my talk this morning. Also, as I look back, even though it looks as if I worked for one institution for many years, in fact, I worked on maybe 80 different countries at different times, and so it was certainly an extremely diverse experience. But as I look at it, there were at least 4 things that jolted what I expected. And in a sense, they're part of the story that I'm going to tell you. The first was working on Africa in the 70s and 80s. Was a very sobering and mind-bending experience, because many African countries became independent in the period 1960, 61, 62. Very few came much later, with huge hope and with confidence and with a sense of what the future held. And yet the 70s and 80s were very difficult years, when many of the countries were in many senses coming apart. Fortunately, the narrative has changed, and at least the narrative now is that Africa is a great success story. But certainly working on Africa during those years made it absolutely essential to grapple with the realities of development. That development was not, as we had expected, an orderly path, whether the career path or the path that was expected, but that it was one full of surprises, needs for adaptation, learning new things, and picking yourself up from failures. Second thing that I came to realize, the World Bank is an institution which is very data-driven. And it's, in a sense, its foundational ideal, as with the United Nations, is objectivity and fairness. But in the culture of the World Bank, and for some of you who come out of the more quantitative disciplines, you will appreciate this, that it's very numbers-driven. So fairness, in a sense, is epitomized in statistical measures. But one of the consequences of that is that discussion of ethical issues tends to be dampened. I had the interesting experience of spending several months in 1996 with the United Nations Refugee Organization. And one of the things that startled me in working there was how far ethical issues were talked about in the cafeteria and everywhere else, because you can't deal with refugee issues or conflict without getting into the issues of right and wrong, and the complexities of right and wrong, and different ways that people see the same realities. And so when Jim Wolfenson asked me to work on the issues of religion and development, which was something I knew almost nothing about 12 years ago, I resisted, but as I started to get into it, I realized that it was a way, an open door to look at the enormously complex ethical issues that are involved in the development field. So in a sense, this ethical language, it's an interesting dilemma because, again, Jim Wolfenson, who was here last year, he was your sort of, distinguished professor. One of the comments that Jim Wolfenson made in dealing with religious leaders was, we cede the ethical high ground to no one. In other words, we don't accept that religious people are more ethical, which frankly a lot of religious people would assume and would argue that you're more moral if you're more religious. But what is interesting is that they, even though they may not be more ethical, at least it's their language and it's their specialty. And so for me, being involved with an extraordinary range of religious leaders has forced me to confront and to think about ethical issues around development that were more or less taken for granted. So that's the sort of another sort of part of my journey. And that is the third, that working on religious issues has brought these ethical issues to the fore. It has also brought me very much into the complexity of the world's cultures and historical traditions. When you're dealing with religious figures, I go to these big interfaith meetings, one of the things that fascinates me is what people wear. And one of my ideas is perhaps to do a book about hats, because they have different hats. Just to give you an idea, I always forget which one it is, but I think it's the Armenian Orthodox have black hats that are pointed, whereas the Greek have ones that are flat. And one comment apparently from the Armenians is that the Greeks have flat hats so the devil can sit on their head. So there are all kinds of sort of stories and so on that go with these. I had one thing where I was absolutely fascinated by some bishops who were wearing pink and peach colored robes. And so I kept going around and saying, who are the pink bishops? And one Catholic guy said to me, look, I can't keep the Catholics straight, much less the others. But I finally found out that they were Thomist bishops from India. So we can tell that story if we need to it. The final comment is that today things are relatively calm in development, though there are some very fundamental critiques of development that those of you who are interested need to be aware of. And I hope you get some of that flavor while you're here. People who have radically different views of what development is about and what's successful. I mean, you will hear people say that development has failed, whereas the more general line is that development has been stunningly successful and that more people are living not in poverty than at any point in human history. But But in any event, you have all sorts of critiques. But one of the things that I hope they have done is to shock people out of any complacency and any sense that there are simple recipes. So those are just a little bit of this. And what this has led me to is a sense that we are talking about enormous complexity and an area where if you don't have humility, you're going to be in serious trouble. So here's what I'm going to try to do, and we'll see how much I get through. That's because I don't need to get through everything. But the first is I'm going to start with a lot of stories and try to bring some of the messages out of them. And I hope that you will also, as we have our discussion, think about some of the messages that you see. Maybe even think about why I've picked these particular vignettes from life. The second is I'm going to talk a little bit about the development business. In other words, what is development today? It's not an easy question because in many ways, international development or development is change and progress. And at this point, the development field actually involves every single discipline and every single issue. You name an issue, and obviously it's an issue for countries and for people who are working on international development. Third, I'm going to highlight some of the ethical challenges that I was talking about before and give you my ladder. Now, you already have the reading that I circulated and a piece that I did, which gives you my ladder, my hierarchy of what are the more important reasons for development. But just to give you an illustration, what people tend to do, there's a wonderful comment about Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression, where it's a speech he never delivered, but one of the things he said is, in a crisis, pull any lever. And in a sense, when people care passionately about the poor in the world and doing something to try to right some of the injustices in the world, we do tend to pull on any argument, whether it's self-interest, you'll sell more goods if you have people who are more prosperous, et cetera. You use any argument. I remember Robert McNamara, when he was the president of the World Bank, talking to one group, and I was a little stunned by this because it was so unlike him. But he basically said, if we don't develop Mexico in Mexico, we're going to be dealing with Mexicans in the United States. In other words, the sort of migration. If you don't deal with them there, they're going to come across the border. But I'm going to give you, go into the latter, and then finally look a little bit ahead. But just because I won't get through everything that I always would like to get through, that's sort of the story of my life, here's what I'm hoping will come out of this for you and for the Institute. I feel very much part of the Institute and hope to continue to be in touch with you about it. But what I want to do is to fuel your interest in the development world and these global challenges of poverty and equity. I think it's part of the reason why you're here. But hopefully, both this session and the whole of the Institute will get you fired up and excited. Secondly, I want to plant some ideas about what your theory of change is and how they link to your values. What are your values? How do they link with what do you think makes change happen? What do you think will make the world a better place? And what is your role in it? I was not familiar with the term theories of change when I was working at the World Bank. It was not part of our vocabulary, but since I've been at Georgetown and I'm working with foundations and philanthropies, I realize this is a big part of their language. In most of their proposal reviews, they will be looking either explicitly or implicitly at what is your theory of change. In other words, what do you think makes things change and what does it happen? What makes things happen? And finding ways to articulate that and to identify what the differences are. Just to give you an illustration, I still remember when I first walked into my graduate program, and there was a wonderful Jamaican, Sir Arthur Lewis, who was a professor. And he said, you know, there are two ways of looking at the world. He said, one is the great man theory of history. He said man, by which he meant that it's people who really make the difference. And he said, then there's the sort of social forces, demography, geography, the kinds of things that you see in Jared Diamond's book, that those are the things that matter. And he said, well, I can't ever decide. He said, so finally what I've done is on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I do the great man theory of history. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, I do the social forces. And then on Sundays, I just relax. I do want to challenge you to respect complexity, that there are no recipes. It's not a simplistic issue, and to hunt for ways to approach complexity. Though you're dealing in a program that's highly interdisciplinary, how do you deal with the fact that, that everybody sees the world a little bit differently, that all of the different disciplines are all relevant? How do you sort your way through the problems of complexity? I told you that I was going to talk about narratives and stories, and that is partly the jargon of the day. I'm sure will hear that you will hear people say, what's your story? I remember last year, actually, Elaine Wolfenson in the tea with the ALBRIGHT Fellows was very taken aback when someone said, what was your love story? And this was not a concept that was familiar to her. But of course, it's very familiar to everyone who does a wedding website or who does this. It's sort of the new thing. What's your story? I'm hearing a lot these days, birth stories, because my daughter's friends are all having babies. So, you know, what was your birth story? But so I'm sure all of you have sort of had to think through, what's my story? What's your elevator speech? But going a little bit beyond that, it is fascinating, and I will give you in a couple of these stories, the way that people see things differently. And actually, I haven't even given you a reference to it, but there's a guy at the, I think he's at the Harvard Business School, Chris Aguirres, who has something called the ladder of inference, where he really goes into how is it that people interpret what they see in the world. But I'll come back to that with some of my stories. And finally, I started this by saying I'm a pragmatic idealist or an idealistic pragmatist. But I think all of us need to balance this. And it will be a critical issue for you during the Institute. How do you balance your idealism, which is part of youth, it's part of why you're selected, with a realistic sense of what it is that you can do and how you can do it? So those are in a sense, my takeaways, what I'm hoping that this talk and this session will at least launch in your minds. This is an image that I put up right in the beginning, which is, it's from Sao Paulo, and it is a very graphic image of the difference in our world between wealth and poverty, and we'll be coming back to that. But what you see, obviously, is a very fancy tennis courts, fancy apartments, beauty, right smack up against densely populated urban slum. And that's really the problem that we're dealing with, wealth and poverty in our world. So turning now to the stories, does anyone have any questions right away? I don't mind at all being interrupted if anyone wants to jump in at any stage. Okay, well, the first one I'm going to start with is Niger education. I don't know how many of you have focused. Has anyone been to Niger? Niger is right near the bottom of the world's poorest countries. It came briefly into the news recently because it has, what does it have, uranium. And during some of the scandals, there were all sorts of to-dos about it. But basically, it's on the margin of the Sahara Desert. People are extremely poor. It's now threatened, in fact, by both the Tuareg rebels and the Islamists. But in any event, the core story was I was the director for the World Bank, and Niger has one of the lowest education enrollment rates in the world. This is boys, but particularly girls. At that time, it was about 20% of children were going to school at all. And I went to visit one school where there were 150 children sitting on the ground with no books, no papers, nothing. And they were the lucky ones because they were at least in school. One teacher, 150 children. With, as I said, no materials, half-built school. And what was frustrating, by the way, which is the complexity in all this, is that there was $200 million sitting allocated for Niger education but we couldn't use it because there was a teacher's strike and there were political problems, and it was almost incomprehensible what was happening. But it was deeply frustrating because it was clearly so important that the children in Niger have the chance to go to school. But it was clearly impossible. So this story was very much in my mind, or these images of the children sitting on the ground were in my mind. But about a week later, 10 days later, I was visiting preschools for my son in Washington. In those preschools, there was a debate. Should you have computers at the age of 3? There were 10, is 10 the right number? 15 for a class, light and colors. So the first message is, if you don't have schools, if you don't have children in schools, what's the hope for these people in the future? Education is so critical. But the second is, how can you possibly see any sense of fairness in what my son faced with a child in Niger? It's the fact that your life is driven by where you're born, the chance of where you're born, is a fundamental issue of unfairness. And it is one that those of us who are working on development are working about, and trying to come to terms with it. Second story. This is also a little bit of a complicated story, but this is the Mauritanian donkeys. I was the country director again for the same department, and Mauritania, which, again, does anyone know Mauritania? Okay, you know Mauritania. So fascinating country, right on the borderline really between Africa and the Arab world. And the country has that divide going right through it. In the valley, the Senegal River Valley, which is the south of Mauritania, you have black Africans with animist, Christian, and Muslim, so a real variety. But the dominant culture in Niger is Arab. They speak Arabic, and they view themselves as Arabic, even though some of the people from Mauritania who were formerly slaves now are very much part of this elite. But it was a difficult time for Mauritania. The World Bank was in an awkward position because we were supposed to be helping to coordinate all of the assistance going to Mauritania, and there were a lot of accusations of human rights abuses. What's called extrajudicial killing, which is people being killed in jails and a lot of other problems. But there were a lot of problems in the valley, the Senegal Valley, which is right along here, with refugees on both sides. People from Senegal had been kicked out into Mauritania, and Mauritanians kicked out. So the land tenure problems, every problem you name it. So I was visiting that. I was supposed to go from Nouakchott, the capital, down to the valley with the Minister of Agriculture. The Minister of Agriculture was a former military guy, and he did not want to be in this car with this woman. But we were trapped for about an hour and a half, 2 hours at least. And so I started to make conversation. So I started asking him about camels. Now, Mauritania has lots of camels. It's sort of a camel culture. They're very proud of their camels. If you go to a dinner in Mauritania, you go out into the desert and you have camel milk at the end, etc. So he knew every camel in Mauritania by name. And so we talked about the meat trade, the milk trade, the hides, how they go up towards Algeria, the whole thing. So he was very happy about the camels. I then moved on to cattle. He knew a little bit about the cattle. And then sheep and goats, he wasn't very interested. So then we moved on. And then we came to the Senegal Valley. And I looked around, and we came into a village, and there were donkeys everywhere. Children riding donkeys, water on the donkeys, moving house on the donkeys, thatch for the roofs, you name it, everywhere. This is a very typical scene with a water carrier. So I said to him, well, what about donkeys? And he said, on n'a pas d'âne, we don't have any donkeys. So I looked around and said, well, what are these? He said, ça n'a pas d'importance, it's not important. So what do I take from this? I take actually a lot of different things. But one is that for him, Mauritania's development problems were the desert and camels. And so he literally didn't see donkeys when they were in front of his face. In a more sophisticated interpretation, his vision of his country and its culture and its agricultural sector had nothing to do with the people, the poor people. It had to do with what he expected. And in general, it is amazing how people do not see what is in front of them if it's not part of their worldview and their world vision. So part of your challenge and our challenge is to try to make sure that we broaden our visions so that we are able to see things that we're not seeing. I mean, I'll give you my illustration. I worked for years and years on development without having any focus whatsoever on religion. My most recent dose with religion had been what was then the obligatory Bible course at Wellesley College, where I had at least learned something. You don't have that anymore here at Wellesley. But in any event, at that time, there was a very good religion department, so I learned quite a bit. So I had gone through, years, decades of working on development without thinking a lot about religion. When I went back to Nairobi, I was amazed at how many churches there were. And the question, of course, was whether the churches had suddenly appeared or whether I had simply not seen them. And the answer is, of course, that I had not seen them. So that's the sort of storyline of how you see, how you conceive, how different pieces go into it is my camel story. The next story is about the Fez Festival of Global Sacred Music, which is one of the fascinating things that I do. It started after the first Gulf War in 1991. It's an annual music festival in Fez, Morocco, which is, to my mind, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It's also the largest living medieval city in the world, where you really do have the old Medina is very much not very dissimilar from what it was probably 600 or 700 years ago. This is a picture of the old Medina. But the Fez Festival, the idea is that by having music from different religious traditions and cultures, that people will, through their emotions, transcend some of the boundaries that separate us among cultures. But this is a unique music festival that it also has very much part of it a forum, a dialogue forum. And I'm the co-moderator of the Fez Forum, which takes place and which is trying to take the inspiration both of the music and of being in the city of Fez to have people think and talk to each other, people who have very different views, taking in new ways. So this was one of the first years we had a panel which was on environment and on climate change. And there were some people who perhaps were not as moved by the spirit as they should have been. But one of my memories is that there was a panel which was all men for some reason. We're still working on trying to make sure that there's a good gender balance, by which I mean at least 50-50. But in any event, it was a panel of all very distinguished men. One of them was was the head of the WTO at the time, Mike Moore, and another was an Algerian activist for organic crops, etc. But at one point during this, at 2 points actually, during this panel discussion, Mike Moore said, imagine a world where every Chinese family has a refrigerator and a car. And then later, because they weren't listening to each other, the Algerian guy said, let's imagine a world, China, where every family has a refrigerator and a car. In other words, they had both said exactly the same thing, but neither of them had first listened to the other, which is, I'm afraid, another lesson for all of you, that people often don't hear things. But secondly, they didn't realize that there was some contradiction. Because what Mike Moore meant was that this is what we want, that every Chinese family has a refrigerator and a car. Whereas for the Algerian activists, that was the end of the world. Because if every Chinese family has a refrigerator and a car, the environment is finished. So, what are the lessons from that? I think this is a sort of a no-brainer. But again, it comes back to communications, which I think is another issue that is very much something that I hope you'll reflect on during this. That it's fine to have an idea, but if you can't get it across, if you can't communicate it. And communications means listening. It doesn't only mean speaking, it means listening. The second is the grip of alternative narratives. In other words, both of these two guys, these two men, had very different visions of what was happening in the world, what should happen. And they were so caught in their own narratives that they didn't even hear what the alternative was. And then the third issue, which, let's be very clear, there are real dilemmas here. This is one of the real dilemmas. If we do not have rapid technological change, we are going to face this issue that with rapid progress in China and India, the current trajectory is sharp increases in use of non-renewable energy resources and a worsening of climate change. And there's no way that in justice you can say to Chinese or to Indians that you have to wait until we have the technological solutions. So there's a real dilemma there. And it's not a dilemma that somebody is actually sitting and discussing, though it does come up in Copenhagen and Rio and all the other big climate meetings, because they're going ahead. And we do have huge issues now about the development of coal plants. It's one of the most contentious issues in development now. What do you do in South Africa? What do you do in India? What do you do in Mozambique and countries which have large coal resources? Coal is the cheapest source of energy, but it's also filthy. So let's never forget that these are not simple solutions, that the Algerian does not have either the right or the power to say stop. Let's go back to a simpler lifestyle where you don't need refrigerators and cars, nor does Mike Moore in the World Trade Organization have the right simply to say we just move ahead with development on the current path. There are really tough issues that are involved, and if you don't face the tough issues, you don't get anywhere. This is, let me tell this story very briefly because I think I'm going on too long. I have these, I have about 50 of these. I was sort of playing with these and couldn't decide which ones to use, but decided at least to give you some sampling of them. Indonesia was considered for many years one of the greatest successes in development. Huge progress on family planning, huge progress reducing the numbers of people who were poor. It's a country that people fell in love with, and people still fall in love with Indonesia. The confidence or the complacency about Indonesia was shattered very abruptly in 1997-98 with the East Asia financial crisis. I remember even 3 or 4 weeks before Indonesia was in deep, deep trouble that the country director, the chief person for the World Bank, was saying, Indonesia is not like Thailand or Philippines. Indonesia is not going to have any problems. The fundamentals are fine. And then sure enough, a few weeks later, Indonesia was facing catastrophe financially and economically. And what that did was to strip away this facade that everything was fine. And one of the major issues that I was concerned about at the time, I actually had 2 areas. I was working on social policy and governance. So governance was that I had to deal with the huge issues of corruption, but social policy was that there was no safety net. Now, what does a safety net mean? It means there was, if somebody was unemployed, there was no unemployment insurance. There was no food program for people who didn't have enough money to buy food. For children who had to pay to go to school, there were no scholarships, so they all dropped out of school. So all of a sudden, the universities were almost emptied. Secondary schools and even primary schools, as parents took their children out to try to work. So all of a sudden we faced this challenge of what do you do? And we had money again, we had the will, but we didn't have the instruments. And one of the frustrating things there was that there are 2 of the largest organizations in the world are in Indonesia, NU and Muhammadiyah. They're Muslim organizations, each with membership around 30 million. In other words, they're huge organizations. But none of the donor community had really worked with them, so they didn't know them. So the Muhammadiyah and NU, both of them said, look, you know, we can help you. We could distribute food. We could do this. But we didn't have the relationships. We didn't know each other. So the lesson in this is, first of all, what I've been working with, that in secular societies, this blindness, this ignorance about religion is a real issue. In this case, it was a practical issue because it meant that we did not have the knowledge and the tools to be able to try to use these logical organizations. And the second is that a lot of this is about relationships. It's about relationships and partnerships, and you don't do these overnight. In other words, you don't just sort of say, okay, we're going to use you. We're going to use the Catholic Church. We're going to use this group. You have to have the knowledge and the relationships over time. And that's, in a sense, our focus now is saying we've got to work towards religious, cultural, and ethical literacy so that people, when they need it, I mean, that's the sort of bottom line, is that when you need it, you need to have the knowledge and the relationships. I'm going to skip, maybe I'll, this is a complicated story, but I'll tell you the story very quickly. I was working on Bolivia. This is in the 1980s, at a very tumultuous time. And one of the exciting things about working in tumultuous times, whether it's elections or even a catastrophe, is that you can think creatively about things. You know, when you're in normal times, you tend to sort of, it's hard to come in with a wild new idea, but when you're in a time of crisis, it's possible. So Bolivia was in a time of huge crisis, 25,000% inflation, all sorts of people being thrown out of government, new people coming in. So I was able to hire somebody to basically go and say, can you come up with new ideas for Bolivia? What do you think could happen? And so this guy, David Morowitz, an Australian economist, sort of wandered around, and he came up with a fascinating idea, which is that Bolivia basically has a river going, Bolivia's landlocked, and it's in the Andes Mountains, but it also has a huge area which is considered one of the sort of Great Plains areas of Latin America. But he said, look, there's the Paraná River, which could be the Mississippi of Latin America. In other words, it could become a trade route. And he said this area of Bolivia has been known for tin and for drugs, for cocaine, but it could have one of the largest soybean production and so on in the world. And so he put this idea out, and it was important at the time, his report, because it helped to change the mentality. Because positive thinking is very important. And people had basically written Bolivia off because it had had 125 governments in 120 years. It was considered corrupt and hopeless. And so the idea that you actually had a vision was very exciting. And the World Bank actually got involved, and they did a project for the Eastern Lowlands and so forth. The project actually then ran into terrible trouble because there were some people, you can't really see the geography of this, but basically way up there is the Amazon, and so the environmentalists started saying you're going to destroy the Amazon Valley, and the people who were indigenous people advocates said you're going to disrupt the indigenous peoples, and the result was that there were study, which are probably somewhere in a room gathering dust. They never had any impact whatsoever. And so it seemed as if it was going nowhere. Now, this Australian actually had an interesting story. He went back to Australia, decided he didn't want to be an economist anymore. This is a bit of composing a life. Studied psychology. I think he came into some money, but he became one of the world's leading experts in sleep for some reason. David Morowitz, you can Google him. He's got techniques of if you can't sleep. But anyway, he took one of his children back to Bolivia, and he sent me an email. I hadn't heard from him in 15 years. Saying that must be the World Bank project with the highest rate of return in history. He said, I've been visiting the Eastern Lowlands, totally transformed, one of the world's largest soybean producers. Dell pineapple is there, growing huge amounts of pineapple, etc. But what was fascinating about this is that I couldn't resist, and so I went back into the World Bank files, and you know, the whole our experiment with looking at strategies was invisible, totally invisible. The project was totally invisible, the Eastern Lowlands. In other words, the review of the project was it was a failure. And yet, that idea And I think that's the message I want to bring to you, is that an idea can be much more important than anything formal. And it wasn't his idea. He didn't invent the idea that eastern Bolivia had huge potential. But he was able to see it and to present it, and therefore to change an environment from pessimism to optimism. So never underestimate the power of ideas. And this is, to me, a peculiar but a fascinating glimpse in the complexity of this. In other words, nobody gave anybody credit. Nobody, when they look at how Bolivia's prospects changed, says it was because of this. And yet, it was a fundamental part of the story. This one is after the tsunami. This is an interesting picture, which I mostly have here for the picture, that when the tsunami hit Aceh in Indonesia, everything disappeared except the mosque, because it was on higher ground, because it was built more solidly. But the story here is, again, alternative narratives. We were looking everywhere for success stories in interfaith cooperation. The Obama administration wanted success stories. Everybody wants success stories. Interfaith work is seen as very important because it means you can be objective, but it also means that you're bringing different groups that may be in tension together. And one of the ways that they come together most successfully is around practical problems. So anyway, we were looking everywhere for success stories, and somebody said, well, look at Aceh after the tsunami, where you had World Vision, Muhammadiyah, NU, the Samaritan, the Salvation Army, Catholic Relief Services, all working together. Aceh had been in a war situation. They made peace after the tsunami, and Aceh is apparently much, much better today than it ever has been, etc. So in any event, this was one of our success stories. We said these big organizations managed to work together, and they really achieved something that was lasting results. Results is another word you'll hear all the time these days, but results. But I sent it to one of my colleagues who was an anthropologist in Indonesia, just to say, I'm wondering what you think of this. And he basically came back and said, I don't know what you're smoking, or what these people have been smoking. Because in fact, what happened is these big organizations went in and they hired all of the local people who were knowledgeable, leaving the local structures feeling resentful and without their best people. And what that did was that it accentuated extremism. So he said, Aceh is now where you have the most acid attacks and where you have the most potential for real terrorism and so on. So you have, this is a case of what? Different narratives, completely different stories about what happened recently in a very important part of the world. So I've been trying to pursue this. I haven't had the resources yet to do it in any detail, but the people who know Aceh that I've presented this dilemma to basically say that they're both true. In other words, that there's no contradiction really between that. There are some clear lessons. I mean, one lesson is that if you don't pay attention to what's happening at the local level, even in a crisis like post-tsunami, where 250,000 people died in Aceh, you're going to get yourself into trouble. You need to pay attention to local structures and to the community. That's one of the issues. Another is that they completely ignored looking at women's issues, which is another issue. So those are sort of two of the lessons that I draw. But beyond that, it's the complexity. So we're almost through the stories. So let me tell you about governance, which is another issue you'll be hearing a lot about. Governance is a very tricky word because it's used to mean many different things. It means basically democracy. It means human rights. It means corruption to many people. It can mean press censorship or press freedom. It means basically sound administration. Do you know what you're doing? Do you have a strategy, a plan? Do you know what you're spending your money on. So governance is a catch-all phrase that's increasingly used, but it is often code for corruption. So this goes back to, actually, it goes back to one of the countries that I had mentioned earlier, but I won't name the country. But in this case, I was visiting, and the person who was the team leader for a public administration project came to me frothing at the mouth, absolutely furious. He said, the most outrageous thing has happened. He had gone to bat for a very expensive management executive education program for people from that country. And I don't know if what they cost nowadays, but executive education programs at places like Wharton and Harvard Business School are obscenely expensive. For a few weeks, it's double what Wellesley would be probably for a year. It's just stunningly expensive. So he had managed that, and he had found out that the people who had done this had basically taken the trip but had not bothered to go pick up the books. They had not showed up. In other words, they had just taken a swan. Presumably they'd been given some cash for per diem, and they didn't even go to the university. So he was furious, and so of course I had to go talk to the minister, and I gave him a long, stern lecture about how terrible this was, and how if my boss knew, there would be hell to pay, and they had to repay it, and so on. He didn't meet my eyes. He wasn't watching me. And so there was a pause after I finished. He turned and he started to change the subject and started talking about a consultancy contract with a French firm, which had cost $2 million to do some study of land tenure and other sort of social issues. And basically the message was that for him that was completely useless, and that the World Bank's pressure to hire the French firm, which was a very respectable French firm, and to do this study was as corrupt, at least, as his guys not showing up at the course. So again, different narratives, different perspectives, but that one was a different, and it gives you a hint on why different groups are not so enthusiastic about fighting corruption, because they see it as a very biased discussion, that it's the North beating up on the South is one way of looking at it. In other words, people are focusing on corrupt officials in the poor countries much more than they are on the people who are actually paying the bribes. And the final thing, final sort of vignette, I think all of us are thinking a lot about the rape crisis in India and what that means. Why is it that these issues, the huge and many, many layered prejudices against women have not been discussed so much before, and what is it that you can actually do about it? I'm sure you know that apart from violence against women and the basic discrimination, you also have what to me is the ultimate bias against women, which is the missing girls. And the missing girls is abortion of female fetuses, but perhaps even more cruel, it's the neglect of girl children, not feeding them, not taking them to the doctor, so that they have a far higher mortality rate than boys. And at the other end of the spectrum, it leads you into the issues of trafficking and so on. So you have this huge prejudice against girls. DSK, does anyone know who DSK, who I mean by that? Yeah, that's the former managing director of the International Monetary Fund, who has this rather extraordinary case of sexual assault in the hotel room. For anyone, we can go into the story if you need to. But in any event, I think what these bring out is that to a degree we've been, or people have been, complacent that the issues of gender bias have been dealt with. That you've come a long way, baby, that you here at Wellesley have the world open to you, that you're not dealing with the problems that my generation was dealing with, that you can't do this, and so forth. But I think that the issue that this brings out is that we still have a very long way to go in addressing the issues of gender bias, particularly at the personal and the family level. In many different countries, the United States included, but it's something that we need to face. And I think we need a revamped, a fresh view of looking at religion. Not at religion, sorry, at gender. So gender matters. The invisibility, that people simply don't see what women are doing. And it comes to, not to women, but to the relationships between men and women. What role does religion play? And above all, what do we do? So let me go very quickly through the rest of my slides. We can open up and you can talk. Is that okay? Because I think if in 5 or 10 minutes we can open it up, that would be good. Does that sound a plan? Okay, the basic message on the development business that I'd like to leave you with is that 40 years ago, when I was thinking about going into a field called international development, it was a relatively straightforward decision, and there were a limited number of institutions that you could work for. In addition, many poor countries literally had almost no trained people. So a country like Zaire at the time, now Democratic Republic of the Congo, I think had 5 university graduates when it became independent. So there was a role for people like us. You know, we could go in and sort of expect to make a big difference. Today, the development field is vastly more complex. The good news is that you have, first of all, you do not have anymore the situation of rich countries and poor countries. To a large degree, that image, which people still use North and South. They still use rich world, poor world. People even talk about the third world, which I suspect many of you don't even know what it means because you don't know what the second world is. But that was the former Soviet Union. In other words, you had for a long time the notion of 3 blocks. You really need to get over those ideas. There are now an infinite variety of different countries at different levels. I think an interesting new paradigm is thinking about the bottom billion, which is looking at the poorest countries, many of which are caught in traps, conflict traps, poverty traps. It's somewhere between 25 and 50 countries are considered to be in that category. And it's a very frustrating business because if you do projects, whether it's an NGO project or a government project or whatever, they're not going to work because the governance systems don't work. So there's a whole search for new approaches to the countries that are at the bottom. There are 2 very interesting books on this. One is Paul Collier's book, The Bottom Billion, and he has a couple of other books. He's an economist from Oxford. The other is the hottest development book at the moment is called Why Nations Fail by James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu. What's interesting about that book is that it sort of debunks everybody else's theories. You know, Jeff Sachs, Bill Easterly, you name it. He basically says geography doesn't matter, culture doesn't matter, quality of leadership doesn't matter. What matters is the elite's roles in governance. So anyway, the fact that he sort of deals with all of it makes it a very interesting book. But in any event, a lot of people are trying to figure out how to sort of deal with this bottom billion. The other issue that people are focusing on a lot now is that 2/3 of the poorest people in the world live in middle-income countries, which is India, China, Brazil, Indonesia, etc. So how do you deal with countries which think they're doing quite well, but really have huge populations of very poor people? So those are sort of the 2 hot development issues at the time. So you have, in addition, a sorcerer's apprentice multiplication of institutions. So much so that nobody can understand and follow them. And that results in the aid chaos, that in a country like Tanzania, they have thousands of reports due to donors. The poor ministers of finance have delegation after delegation visiting them, wanting attention. So one of the hot issues at the moment, besides results, which everyone wants results, is aid harmonization. In other words, really trying to get all of the different groups to work together in some coherent way. So those are our major issues. Another theme, which a lot of this comes out of bitter experience. People say you learn from failure. So a lot of these lessons come out. But another one is that ideas coming from outside are not going to work. In other words, if you don't have a commitment from people at the country level, nothing is going to happen. And so country ownership is another word that people use. Sometimes country, what people mean by country, gets very fraught. In other words, do you mean the government? And if you're talking about Zimbabwe, you don't really want to deal with Mugabe's government, or are you talking about the people? You hear that in Haiti a lot. In other words, should you be dealing with the government, or should you be dealing in some way with the people? But then who decides who the people are, and how do you work with them? So bottom line here, you're in a very new and a very complex ball game in talking about development. It's public, private, it's civil society, it's think tanks. Coming back to one of my stories, it's about ideas as much as it is about money. And it's changing very fast. So it's a fascinating area to be involved in, but not an easy one. I think I would mention here just that every single discipline is involved in development. So all of you, with all of your different disciplines, you all have something to contribute. And as you do your projects and your presentations, I hope that you will find that you have a piece for every single one of them. Lots of tensions, which I'll skip over. So one of the questions is, why care? I think that I've taken this for granted in my presentation. But very clearly, I think that the issues of poverty and equity in the world are the major challenge facing us, facing you, and facing your children. That if we do not deal with inequality and inequity in the world, we are headed for deep, deep trouble. But the other side, and these are two videos that I strongly recommend that you look at by this fantastic Swedish public health specialist. Has anyone seen Hans Rosling's videos? Okay, a couple of people have seen them, but I strongly recommend them because apart from anything else, they give you a dose of optimism. And one of his messages in his best video is, the seemingly impossible is possible. That we have seen stunning transformations from hopelessness to success. I mean, just one example is Singapore. When I started working, this is my lifetime, my professional career, Singapore, I have reports that wrote it off as a complete basket case. Ethnic problems, the communists are going to take charge. They have no resources, they're just a small island, hopeless governance, and now it's one of the most successful countries in the world with one of the best education systems. So the seemingly impossible is possible, but we need to deal with it. So on the ethical side, this is just a few of the many different ways that you can look at ethics: the Earth Charter, the Global Ethic, Charter of Compassion, Amartya Sen, the Human Development Index. I actually go back to Gandhi's Social Sins from 1926. These are all things that you can look for if you're curious. But the point is that there are a lot of frameworks that I find inspiring, but also fascinating, both for their similarities and for their differences. The Millennium Development Goals really constitute, in a sense, the closest thing to a current world agreement on what you need to do. And for all of you, as you come into your careers, you may not remember this, but the year 2000 inspired these goals, the Millennium Development Goals, and they set a deadline because it's part of this. If you don't have a deadline, if you don't measure, it's not going to work. So 2015 is the deadline. So there's a lot of contemplation going on as to what next. What goals should we have beyond 2015? So that, I think, is an important issue. But basically, as I sort of went through this and as I've thought about it, to me there are 5 different ways of looking at the reasons for caring about development, which is what I call the ethical scaffold. And again, because you've read this, I'll go through this very briefly. I mean, basically, it's about rights. It's, I was at a meeting this morning, actually, before I came here, which is talking about Albert Schweitzer and the Schweitzer Hospital in Gabon. But basically, Schweitzer's philosophy is exactly the same as the principle that is under the Bill Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is that everyone has the right to decent health care. Everyone has a similar right. In other words, there's nothing that makes someone who's born in India have a different right to health than someone else. But how do you deliver that? And I would also extend that. That goes back to my story about Niger and the schools. Why should those children not have any right to education? That's not about charity. It's not about whether we have enough money. It's a basic right. And this is the sort of fundamental side of it. And these are, actually this picture here is, interestingly, it's actually about obesity. It's an Oliphant cartoon, but the caption says, "Who let the Americans on board?" Which is, but these are sort of images, particularly from other parts of the world, where you see the sense that the United States is greedy. So one to be aware of. But the second is that we should never lose the sense of charity and compassion. Now, charity is a tricky thing, because charity can be very patronizing. It can lead to dependence. If it's voluntary, who's going to make sure that there's enough money for the schools and for the health if it's just up to who decides to write a check on December 31st? But the compassion and the caring that are part of the best impulses of charity are not something we should ever let go. So the sense of charity and philanthropy is something that we should look at and treasure, even as we look at the pitfalls. This is one of the rare headlines, of something that we forget, that there are 20,000 children a day who die of preventable diseases. Actually, this would now no longer be acceptable, this photograph, because it's called development porn. And the current wisdom is that if you show positive pictures of a girl looking happy, you'll get more money donated than if you show a picture of a starving child. But more important, I think, is that child or his parents had no say in having that picture on the front page of an Australian newspaper. But in any event, this compassion issue, touching people's heartstrings, is still important, even though we recognize the pitfalls of charity. The third is there's a lot of thinking these days about social entrepreneurship, the bottom of the pyramid, lots of exciting things of selling tiny sachets of shampoo for small amounts of money. People will argue that you should care about poverty because it's a huge market, you'll make more money. So that's an argument that, again, a lot of people use. It comes back to my talking in the beginning. And the fourth one is the Robert McNamara argument that if you don't deal with poverty in Africa and in Central and Latin America, you're going to deal with it here because of migration and the movements of people in the world. And the fifth argument is, in a sense, one that we shouldn't even have to make, but it is that the world that is deeply divided is not safe, and no one can be safe in a world of huge inequality. There are no walls that can keep us from the anger of people who feel that there's been injustice, and terrorism is linked. We know that terrorists are not poor, and we know that poor people are not terrorists, but that doesn't change the fact that there are very complex links, and that this sense of injustice, seething sense of injustice, is fueling violence in a lot of parts of the world. There's a terrifying story by Nadine Gordimer. It's called Fairy Tale, but it's about a South African family that starts with tremendous goodwill, and then gradually they build walls around themselves with barbed wire, and in the end their child is caught in the revolving blades of the of the barbed wire that surrounds their house. So that's the sort of downside. So areas for action, I think we've talked about that, and for dialogue. So basically, Niger, the basic takeaway from that, I say my children, the first thing that they learned to say was no. But the second thing they learned to say was it's not fair. I think a sense of fairness is hardwired into all of us. And to me, the Niger story is it's not fair. It's not fair that some children have school and some don't. On Mauritania, it is trying to make sure that we see our blind spots and find ways to understand when someone has a very different narrative, where that narrative is coming from, and then finding ways to try to change that. The story of Fez and the forum at Fez is about how debates can be so stuck, people can't hear each other, the complexities that are involved in the issues, but also the use of creativity, like music, to try to open people's minds and spirits. In Indonesia is a reminder of partnerships and relationships. A lot of this is about people and relationships. Bolivia, you need to see these issues in the long haul. And you need to see the power of inequality, but also the power of ideas. Aceh is the humanitarianism and development and what cooperation can do and what it can't do. The story of governance is just a brief glimpse for you into the dilemmas of the corruption issue, which for many people, when they hear development, the next thing they think is corruption, and how do you deal with it? And I'm sure you'll be talking about that over the course of the Institute, but it's a very critical issue. And finally, I think you all have a very distinctive advantage in thinking about the gender issues that are facing us in the world and what it is that we can do about it. I'm not going to read that. So these are just a few things that we can look at, and let's open it up for discussion and questions. So you have microphones. Who's gonna launch?
My name is Shu Yu, and I come from China. I'm a senior. So my question is about your work with religion. So you told us a story that, like, the Armenian argue that Greek people's head is flat and because of devil. So how do you argue right and wrong with these religious leaders when their ideology is really rooted in their history and their, like, thousands of years of culture? And also when these high-level religious leaders have these rooted judgment with each other, so how can we work with them to ensure that their leadership can cause a population with like nice minds and willingness to help each other around the world?
One of the issues that came out as Jim Wolfenson sort of launched this dialogue with the world's religions, but we're seeing it within the United Nations system, within the US government, et cetera, is that for some complicated historical reasons, the whole international relations field and all of the disciplines that are involved in the United States and probably even more in Europe lost sight completely of religion for decades. So people had never studied it, they hadn't read books about it, some people, of course, personally did, but it was not part of the conversation. And part of the reason was that there was an assumption that religion would become less important with development and would basically disappear. That was sort of the operating assumption. From 1979, when you had the Iranian Revolution, but of course even more with some of the fundamentalist movements, both in the Muslim world but also in countries like the United States, people have had to rethink that completely. And so there is a growing awareness that being ignorant and ignoring religion is just plain stupid. The United States, it's fascinating, there's a book by Stephen Prothero called Religious Illiteracy, and they've done surveys that many people in this country, including very religious people who go to church, have no idea what Jacob's Code or the Noah's Flood or any of these things are. So it comes back to a long history in development, in diplomacy, and international affairs where people have simply not seen religion. And the fact is, religion has not gone away. There are books that say there's a religious resurgence. It's not completely clear to me that there's a resurgence in the sense that people believe differently or that religion is bigger or more important. But it certainly is much more visible, and it is huge. And 84% of the world's population, by a very recent Pew study, say that religion is important, shapes their values. Perhaps more important if you ask them, who do you respect? Government leaders, NGOs, business, religion wins every time. So even though some of them are very biased and corrupt and everything else, they win over every other group, police, etc., in survey after survey. The people that I deal with tend to be very wise and interesting people. I deal with some people with whom I disagree profoundly on issues like contraception. I mean, to me, I still find it hard to believe that people are against contraception, but there are people who are against contraception, much less abortion. But maybe there even are some here, and I respect them. But we find common ground on many other areas. And that was sort of Jim Wolfenson's idea in dealing with the world of religion, is that, look, there are two groups. Who cares about the poor? It's the religious groups and it's the development community. Nobody else cares about them, so they should be working together. So there are people who are profoundly wise and fascinating people who are in the interreligious circles. The biggest issue that we face is the people who are not part of these circles. In other words, the ones who are either at the extremes or at the fringes. Shall I give you I don't want to take too much time, but let me give you one example. There's a group called Family Watch International, and I was with a Scandinavian person at a meeting, and she said, what is this group? And what is America coming to was the basic message. They completely derailed the whole AIDS summit at the United Nations. So I'd never heard of them. So has anyone heard of Family Watch International? It's a group based in Arizona. It's actually registered as an NGO, and it is it's a non-religious, it's supposed to be non-religious, but the head of it is a Mormon. And basically they're in the group that thinks that the United Nations is black helicopters. Everyone know what I mean when I say that? That the United Nations is the problem, that the United Nations is trying to take over the world, that they have black helicopters that are going to go. And there are people who think that, but it's my image that I'm using. But in any event, what they did in this group was that they invited all the small countries in the United Nations to a meeting in Arizona and had them have homestays with healthy American families, in other words, two-parent families that were not gay and that thought homosexuality was wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And then they briefed them on all the language that they should oppose in the United Nations summit. And so that was why these small countries then had opposed all of the language. So I did a blog on this, on Family Watch International, and one of my colleagues, who is conservative, came to me and said, you really should talk to the person. So I ended up having a conversation with the Mormon woman who's the head of this. And I'm still grappling with, is it worth trying to have a dialogue? Is it worth trying to have a discussion with someone whose beliefs are so fundamentally different from ours, and you could say whose values are different? Interestingly, I found, I was trying to find some common ground for this telephone conversation, and the first issue that I tried was maternal mortality, because I thought, who can be against mothers dying in childbirth? We must be able to find common ground. But it was clear that she immediately, with maternal mortality, thought abortion. And so she said, well, you know, our objective is if someone's pregnant to make sure she carries the baby to term and is healthy and that the baby is delivered in a healthy way. Never mind what happens to the baby afterwards. So I decided that was not common ground that we were going to find. But what we did find common ground on was orphanages. Because she's adopted 3 children from Mozambique who are AIDS orphans, which, you know, it makes you think. This is someone who who cares. But she also works with an orphanage in Mexico, which is an orphanage orphanages, I don't know if you know this, but orphanages are now bad in the development thinking, in the current professional wisdom, because orphanages are open to abuse. A lot of children in orphanages are not really orphans. It's better to care for children in communities. You have all sorts of people who are abusive in orphanages, so that's become an issue. And so she was onto the same issue. So in a sense, theoretically, we could start with orphanages and with the problems and how do you deal with children who are abandoned and neglected, and then move from there perhaps into other issues. So the issue is not so much the sort of wise religious leaders who really have an ethical language and who appreciate complexity, many of them, but it is the fringes. And how do you find ways to talk to people with whom you seem to have no common ground? But I think you have to. If I can come back to the first point, ignoring religion. I ignored it for a lot of my career. And now that I go back, I see a lot of mistakes I made because I was not more sensitive to and more alert to both people's beliefs and what it is that motivates them, but also the practical role of religious infrastructure and leadership in communities. It's the only infrastructure in most communities, most poor communities in the world. So let's go to the back.
As a former World Bank director, what would you respond to people in the developing world, so the bottom billion, who would claim that the World Bank and the IMF hurt more than they help those countries? And for example, with regard to the structural adjustment programs.
I genuinely think that both the World Bank and the IMF do far more good than they do harm. But I'm also aware of why it is that people see otherwise. And the reasons that they see it differently is partly some realities of arrogance and insensitivity, perhaps having cultural blinders. It is also a part of myth and an unwillingness to deal with the realities that are involved. I did a book on the World Bank, and there is a section in there, if you want to look at it, which is sort of my take on structural adjustment. Because I have to say that I'm very frustrated about exactly the kind of comment that you made, because I think that it is ahistorical. This is a historian who speaks, and that it fails to appreciate what it is that was happening. It also, I think, fails to appreciate the diversity of different situations. Basically, structural adjustment, for those of you who, I guess you all have heard of structural adjustment, it's reform programs. Well, let me first give you one of the more horrible images, but it, I think, has some merit to it. This was a Chinese official who told my boss this at the time. He said, if you have a puppy and you have to cut off its tail, if you cut off the tail all at once, the puppy will yelp, but it will be okay, and it will be fine. But if you cut off the tail a little bit at a time, you're going to have a very sick and a very angry puppy. So one of the ideas was, and this was, what does this have to do with structural adjustment? The argument was that if you have to make major reforms, you could even look at the fiscal cliff, you need to do it all at once. Without a whole lot of discussion and argument, just do it, is sort of the argument. Because if you try to do it a little bit at a time, you'll have opposition develop. So when there were huge crises in the world, the initial thought was, okay, let's do these reforms that are needed in order to make the countries viable again. Let's do them quickly all at once. And the expectation was that you would have an adjustment in structure, whether it was energy prices or devaluation or whatever, or cutting civil service, and then you could go back to normal. What became clear over the years is that reform is a continuing process. It wasn't a one-off. That's one thing that became clear. So instead of having the idea that you just have a one-off reform, by the way, the other side of it was that if you did the one-off reform, you got $100 million or $200 million. So it was obviously, there was a certain appeal in it. But that's the first, is that you can't, that whole idea was invalid. But the second one was that the economists who designed this in the beginning were focusing on a series of reforms that really could be done by executive authority, like a devaluation or others. Whereas most reforms, you need participation, you need parliamentary approvals, you need laws, you need people to implement. And so this idea that you could just do it all at once quickly clearly failed. And so you had pretty quickly an evolution in thinking about these programs towards a much more long-term vision. The kind of harm that people have in mind is if you have to raise prices, if you have to cut budgets. And those, I think, are the two main things that people worry about. Now, obviously, if you, when you have huge subsidies of food, for example, where the cost of food, again, these are very complicated issues and stories, but what happened in many cases is that the food price was kept down for the urban populations. And what that meant was that the farmers didn't get enough money for their food, and therefore they didn't produce food. And then sometimes they would try to have the price be artificially maintained so the farmers got money and the urban people paid less, but who was going to pay for the difference? That became the subsidy issue. And on budgets, when you have governments that are spending more than they are making, getting in, you're going to have a problem. And you had a lot of countries, Niger, which I talked about at one point, the civil servants' salaries hadn't been paid, the military hadn't been paid in 6, 8, 9 months. So that was the sort of crisis that you had to deal with. So that's a long answer. There's no question, I don't think, that these organizations are well-intentioned. What their narrative is an issue. One of their narratives is that if you don't have growth, you don't have anything. In other words, if you don't have economic growth, you're not going to have any money to pay for schools or health. You're not going to have jobs. So for goodness sake, first and foremost, get growth going. And there really isn't a good counter-argument to that, unfortunately. But the question then becomes, how do you get growth going? And you have sort of very different schools between people who think that just basically get the sort of economy working and then leave the rest to the market, and others who think that you really need to have projects and programs and sector strategies that will really address different parts of the economy. That's just the beginning of a long discussion. Should we?
Sorry, so again, I'll start. My name is Nancy, and I'm a junior, and I was wondering if during your time in the 60s, 70s, or 80s when you were working on development, if you saw a narrative of economic growth will lead to political stability, and what's the narrative now on that?
Well, economic growth and leads to instability because it upsets traditional patterns. So that, I think, is a reality that we have to deal with, and that is one of the issues that is contributing to some of the backlash on gender issues that we're seeing in some places, is a discomfort with the realities that people moving to cities and people having different kinds of jobs and children being educated disrupts traditional life and traditional societies. I mean, one problem, I think, is that people tend to romanticize traditional life and to think that things were really better in the olden days. My sense is that that's not something that is profoundly distorted. A society where a quarter of the children die before they're 5, where very few people live past 40, where people have very few opportunities is a problem. But as we also know, for you, you have every choice in the world open to you. You can do all kinds of things. That's much more complicated than knowing that your future is that you're going to get married and have children and take care of a house. So modernization is profoundly disruptive. The people would like to see a correlation between good governance and democracy, and justice. It's not so simple because the world is such a diverse group of countries. And whenever you look at statistics about development, you should never forget the role that China and India play in any aggregate numbers, because they are so huge that they dominate. So if you're looking at inequality figures, if you're looking at even education or health, you need to remember that those two countries represent such a huge part of the world's population, particularly if you're looking at the poorer ranks, that colors any sort of theories or hypotheses that you have. So that's another piece of it. So when you look at correlations, you can't keep China out of the equation. You need to have China be a part of it, and India. So when you're looking at, the Gambia or Malawi or whatever, it's really it needs to be in a different pool if you're trying to see how progress and change relate to democracy. Do you want to do one more?
I think we better stop.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking Katherine.